Hello, Brubs. We're back with Young Adolf, a book by Beryl Bainbridge, and we are on chapter 8. Each time Adolf opened his eyes, huge shadows drifted above him. He knew there was a party to progress. He distinctly heard music and people singing. Bah. At one moment, despairing of ever persuading him to dance, they dragged him horizontally across the floor. A series of images flickered in front of him: a girl in a cream blouse, an old woman waving her arms in anguish, a man with hair the color of silver wagging a solemn finger, and Alois holding a wine glass up to the goose-necked lamp on the wall, was talking about the day before yesterday. Of course, Mother took his part. A bruise the size of an egg on my left temple. She said he would never have gone into the cemetery unless I led him. The unfairness of this conversation roused Adolf. He remembered quite clearly how he had pulled back and refused to enter the cemetery. He didn't want to look directly at Edwin's grave. It was bad enough seeing that small gray cross from the window of his bedroom. He struggled upright, determined to call Eloise a liar, and found he was standing in a room facing towards a door inset with a panel of stained glass. There were no steps outside, only a drop to a small and azure blue backyard. In the middle of the yard stood a tall youth brandishing a chopper above the head of a child who crouched in blue dirt on blackberry-colored knees. The room was empty, save for a rusted bathtub in the corner. What do you got, bruvs? Above it, riveted precariously to the wall, sagged an elaborate cylinder made of copper. Draped over the edge of the tub was a little red towel, scarlet as a poppy, so bright that Adolf stared at it for a long time, thinking what a nice painting it would make. The towel, the cylinder, the panes of blue glass set in the door, leading nowhere. Suddenly he realized he was being watched, knowingly, by a man in a stained cravat who was standing on a wooden crate and urinating. White with disgust, Adolf ran down the dark stairs, unsettling the aspidistra on its rickety pedestal, and glimpsed out the corner of his eye the man with silvery hair, now dwarfed by the girl in the cream blouse, who towered above him in some miraculous way as they waltzed sluggishly about the landing. Alois was still talking, waggling the stem of his glass so close to Adolf's face that it seemed he intended to grind it into splinters up his nostrils. 3 had died, don't forget, Gustav and Ida in infancy, Edwin at 6 of the measles. As mere stepchildren, Angela and I didn't get a look in. Adolf lay down and folded his arms over his eyes. Somebody was crying. An enormous tear splashed onto his mouth and saturated his chest. What am I doing? I'll tell you what I'm doing, Billy Gavey. I'm reading this book called Young Adolf, and it's a novel about a young Adolf Hitler, apparently. It's supposed to diminish him, but so far all it's done is diminish the talents of this writer, Beryl Bainbridge, because this book is literal schlock. Chapter 9. Bridget waited at a safe distance while her husband emptied the jug of water over the sofa. Should a fight break out, she was ready to tell Alois she had stood enough and was off to stay with her cousin Bernadette in Knotty Ash. Adolf woke. He sat up and, like a swimmer, breathing or breasting a wave, hung gasping over the back of the sofa. Right, said Alois. There's a tap on the landing and a mirror in the lavatory upstairs. I'll leave you my razor. When I return, I expect to find you washed and shaved and moving about. You'll lose the use of your limbs if you lie there much longer. Do you hear? Yes, said Adolf. Surely, he thought. Alois was talking with his tongue in his cheek. Had he forgotten the beatings he himself had taken as a boy for not washing his neck properly, for not getting up promptly enough from his bed in the morning? How exactly like old man Hitler he sounded. He glanced at the wall, half expecting to see those lips in the photograph above the hat stand opening and closing. Yeah, this is the Bible, motherfucker. Now that you've come, Alois continued, you might as well explore the city. No point in wasting the money you've already squandered on the ticket. But you'll need clothes. If you were living next door with the riffraff, it wouldn't matter. This, however, is a respectable house, and you'll only draw attention to yourself dressed the way you are. He looked meaningfully at Adolf. We don't want that, do we? Not the way things stand. No, said Adolf, though he wasn't entirely sure what Alois was driving at. There's nothing of mine that will fit, but I'll have a word with Meyer. Alois took the pocket watch and studied it. He was still wearing his gloves and his expensive topcoat. It's 10 o'clock, he told Adolf. I want you on your feet in half an hour. Adolf looked at the windows to see if it was night or day. It was hard to tell. The sky outside was gray as slate. It had stopped raining. Thank you, he said. He gave a small, submissive smile. He was thinking that until he had thought out why he was here and what he intended to do once he knew, there was no harm in appearing to be grateful. Alois was an open book to him. For all his blustering talk, his apparent firmness, he was good-natured, tolerant, and so completely without depth that it was impossible for him to sustain rancor for longer than half an hour at the most. Bridget went on to the landing with her husband. He was delighted at having dealt with Adolf so satisfactorily. He kissed Bridget's cheek and laid a gloved hand on her breast. She instantly drew away, worried that Mr. Meyer might be lurking around the bend of the stairs. She didn't want him inflamed beyond reason, with only the wary Adolf left to protect her. She sensed that her withdrawal had annoyed Alois. He had taken it for revulsion. She thought sadly that it was on such foolish misunderstandings that lives floundered and love went flying out of the window. But then his love for her, she well knew, had flown long ago, and he would jump at the excuse to skedaddle. Alois's irritation was momentary. Later in the day, he had an important appointment with a manufacturer from Sheffield. He was convinced that it would lead to a substantial commission. And there's the train. We won't have any more trouble from him, he said, nodding in the direction of the front room. Obviously, he responds to authority. He descended the stairs 2 at a time, filled with optimism. Bridget gave her brother-in-law a basin and a towel. She showed him the tap on the landing and the sink in the alcove. She said hesitatingly, I'd wash your shirt, but there's nothing you could wear in the meantime but an old blouse of mine. Alois is very fussy about lending his clothes. He looked at her blankly. Her knowledge of German was poor and her accent atrocious. It took a little time for him to fathom what she meant. It doesn't matter, he said. Please don't trouble yourself. Perhaps there is a muffler I could borrow. She found it equally difficult to understand him. He spoke differently from Eloise. No, she said, hoping that was the right answer. When Adolf returned with the basin, he was bleeding from several minute cuts on the chin. He flung the safety razor contemptuously onto the table. Now that his face was clean and the stubble gone from his jaw, he appeared younger and more fatigued than ever. Watching him sidle across the room, Bridget nearly burst out laughing. She wasn't an unkind girl, but with that funny walk and his ridiculously shrunken jacket, he reminded her of one of the broker's men in a pantomime. Food, she said. You'll need some food. She settled the coals and put the pot on to heat. While she stood there minding the soup, she was thinking how like Eloise he was, and yet how different. Eloise was flamboyant and confident, plumped out with self-regard. The young man standing at the window was painfully thin, and his shoulders were rounded. He had a long, bony face and a pointed nose. Unless she turned him to the light and deliberately stared into those bright blue eyes, she had no means of telling why. Though of the same color and shape as Eloise's, they were so utterly dissimilar in expression. Perhaps Adolf took after his mother. Mother! Despite his long rest, Adolf felt tired and weak. There was no strength in his legs, and his heart was behaving strangely. Just walking from the door to the window had caused it to leap in his breast in a painful flutter of beats that left him sick and giddy. He clung to the window frame. The rows of black houses on the gray street tilted suddenly and slid towards the leaden gray of the sky. Are you all right? Asked Bridget. He didn't look it. He hadn't a speck of color in his face, and he was buckling at the knees. Quite all right, said Adolf, and forcing himself to stand upright, he limped to the sofa and made a feeble attempt to straighten its wrinkle cover. He punched the cushions into shape and picked up the blankets. No, cried Bridget, taking them from him. It's not necessary. She thought there was no sense folding them when possibly it was fumigation they required. Adolf sat at the table and found himself facing the photograph of his father. He moved immediately. When I was on the landing, he said, I thought I heard shouts, and then there was a crash as if something fell. You heard right, Bridget said. It's them next door. They'll be pulling up the floorboards to burn on the fire. They're nothing but a heap of savages. Then, dimly remembering how Mr. Meyer had explained to her that it wasn't the fault of the poor if they were pig ignorant, but due to the greed of the ruling classes, or someone like that, she added, the woman on the second floors had 19 children, and there's 16 of them in one room, hacking the place to bits. The daddy's a Portuguese man, and she's an albino. You know, she's got pink eyes and no lashes to speak of. Only the other day, one of them ran amok with an axe. The family underneath are scared for their lives. Adolf had understood little of Bridget's conversation. He noticed that she had a snub nose and a wide, rather brutal mouth. Standing there, waving that wooden spoon in the air, he thought she lacked refinement. His ideal woman, the divine Stephanie, with whom he had fallen in love in Vienna, had been tall with hair as pale as glass. While he was drinking his soup, a man's voice from somewhere outside on the stairs called Bridget's name. She sat as if turned to stone, the blood draining from her face. Adolf now realized that the vulgar patches of scarlet on her cheeks he had mistaken for rouge were in fact clusters of freckles, fading as he watched. Her eyes, too, were flecked with gold. Is it bad news? He asked, but she rose from the table and left him without a word. When she returned, some moments later, apple-cheeked as ever, she wouldn't look at him directly. Mr. Meyer, she said, speaking to the wall, is waiting downstairs to see you. Adolf remained in his chair, baffled. Don't you remember? Asked Bridget. You met him the night you arrived. He's the landlord. She grew impatient. The man with the violin, she shouted, tucking in her chin and miming the scraping of a bow across strings. The clever one. Now Adolf knew whom she meant. Instantly he felt restored to health. Some of his so-called friends had been dreadful fools. The banality of their thoughts had appalled him. When talking to them, he was oppressed by the feeling that he mouthed on the other side of a thick wall, unheard, unseen. He had read that great artists, great people felt unseen. He had read that great artists, great people felt exactly as he did, but it wasn't much comfort. Now some instinct told him everything would be different. He forgot entirely his previous mistrust of the fiddler. He jumped up from the table, eyes shining, as though he was about to meet an old and valued comrade. But first he must wash up the dish and the spoon he had used. Whoa, whoa. Right. Leave them, Bridget said curtly. He thought he had offended her in some way. Thank you for the meal, he said. I greatly appreciated it. She snatched up his plate and turned her back on him before the words were out of his mouth. Later, Bridget went down to the basement to ask Mary O'Leary if she had any material suitable to be made into a shirt. She wanted to make amends to Adolf for having snapped at him earlier. It wasn't fair to take it out on the poor young fellow just because she grew agitated whenever Meyer gave her so much as the time of day. She told Mary she didn't mind what stuff it was. Anything at all would do. An old sheet, perhaps. What's that supposed to mean? Asked Mary O'Leary. Old sheets is all we have, and you're not cutting them into pieces. In the end, she fished out a length of brown linen shut in a battered suitcase in the coal cellar. Who does that belong to when it's at home? Said Bridget. Mary O'Leary explained that the gentleman in the attic had left it with her for safekeeping 14 years ago. Brown, Bridget said dubiously. It's an odd color for a shirt. Get away, scoffed Mary O'Leary. The one he's wearing is like a rag the doggy brought in. She beat the material with her hand to let out the dust. There was only a smattering of mildew along the creases. Chapter 10. This might be a long one. No, not long. Chapter 10. Does anybody know of who won the World Series? Chapter 10. Had the fiddler lived in tawdry surroundings, in a room filled with cheap knickknacks and hung with second-rate paintings, of the sort Eloise admired, Adolf was prepared to tell himself it didn't matter. A man, he felt, should be judged by his intellect, not his possessions. As it happened, Meyer's apartment had a grandeur that might have been oppressive, but for the fact that each time the door was opened or closed, quantities of plaster fell from the ceiling and clung like snow to every available surface. The furniture, old and dark, monumental in size, was liberally sprinkled with flakes of white, as were the window-sills. The effect was festive. Pinned above the fireplace was a collection of photographs cut from newspapers showing workmen rioting, the Titanic on her maiden voyage, and a woman wearing an agonized expression holding a bundle in her arms. Propped against the straddle-legged clock on the mantelpiece was a faded daguerreotype of a young man with insolently staring eyes. Along the length of one wall stood an immense glass-fronted bookcase. The first morning, seeing Adolf gazing hungrily at those volumes behind the glass, Meyer had said, "Come here whenever you like, Adolphus. Read what you want." Upon hearing those words, Adolf knew that he'd found someone worthy of his friendship. He'd had many acquaintances in his life. Hanisch, whom he had met in in the Assel at Meadling, at the Assel in Meadling, Joseph Newman, the art dealer, a one-eyed locksmith named Robinson. From Newman he had once accepted the gift of a frock coat and a pair of woolen mittens, only slightly darned across the knuckles. Hanish had taught him how to survive the winters, shown him what buildings he might loiter in to avoid the cold, where to find free handouts of food, how to earn a few kreuzer, shoveling coal or humping baggage at the station nearby. Hanish had even taught him the words of Watch on the Rhine one night when, both cold and hungry, they grew quite hysterical with misery and could have been mistaken for drunk. But in his heart he had never thought of either Newman or Hanish as his friends. There's my friend, the train. It was true he'd become almost fond of Gustel, the young musician from Linz, but it hadn't lasted. First time around, Gustel had passed the examination into the Academy of Music. With Meyer, Adolf sensed there would be no such betrayal. Meyer was old and could be trusted not to succeed where he himself had failed. Taking seriously the invitation to visit the downstairs room whenever he wished, Adolf began to spend most evenings there, reading at the table until midnight. Sometimes Meyer, leaving the Adelphi by the side door, would find the young man waiting dog-like in the alleyway, then talking obsessively about various operatic productions he had seen in Vienna. Adolf would escort his friend home, never failing to remark that Meyer's nightly playing of great musical works was of supreme importance. You may be right, Meyer would murmur, jaded from an evening rendering of such classic pieces as the Cockadoodle Rag and Hitchy Coo, and everybody's doing it now. Alois grumbled frequently, though he didn't particularly relish the company of his half-brother. He was annoyed at his behavior. He said he was sick of Adolf treating the upstairs room as an hotel, coming in for meals and rushing out again. You presume too much, he criticized. Meyer likes his privacy. It reflects badly on me, bruv. I presume nothing, cried Adolf. I understand him perfectly. Meyer gave him a topcoat, which, though warm, was overlarge. Bridget was always meaning to turn up the sleeves. It billowed about him as he walked. It had originally belonged, Meyer said, to a relation. Adolf thought the relation must have money to burn because the coat was practically unworn. In the same wardrobe hung a jacket of dark blue with buttons of gold. Beneath it, placed neatly side by side and stuffed with paper, was a pair of golfing shoes. Secretly, Adolf thought the jacket splendid and was disappointed he wasn't asked to try it on for size. Instead, Meyer foisted on him a pair of elastic-sided boots. I don't need boots, Adolf protested. There's nothing wrong with the ones I'm wearing. He was mystified at Meyer's insistence. The boots, being of supple leather, took him by surprise. He bounced as he stepped. When Bridget finished the shirt she was making and showed it to him, he was genuinely delighted. He changed into it at once. Alois, seeing him strutting about the front room, eyeing himself in the mirror above the fireplace, couldn't help smiling. It's a queer color, he said. Adolf took no notice. The brown shirt meant he needn't sit wrapped in a blanket while his other one was in the wash. He hadn't been so well dressed for years. Sometimes, if the wind was behind him, in his spring-heeled boots and his voluminous coat, he flapped down the hill like a black crow. Meyer had to run to keep up with him. Several mornings a week, whatever the weather, Meyer showed him something of the city. They would walk along the Huskisson Street past the 5-story houses built for the shipping owners and the cotton brokers, pillars and steps of granite at the front entrance and stabling at the back for carriage horses. Every horse, or every house, decaying now, the stables torn down, the windows smashed, each one inhabited by a dozen families or more. Their washing hanging sodden on the wrought iron balconies, and a herd of ragged children squealing pig-like in the gutter. The rich have gone long since, observed Meyer, fled to the hills where the air is cleaner. Clean air or not, Adolf told him, I have never been so well. It was true. Even though the air was damp, and in the past he'd been subject to bronchitis, here he felt exhilarated and full of energy. It had to do, he thought, with some quality of the northern light. The blackened city seemed to sail in an ocean of white sky, perpetually racing before the wind. You're just eating properly, Meyer said, and then, of course, you don't work. On the corner of Hope Street, in a house with broken windows, lived Meyer's friend, Dr. Cephalus. His door faced St. James's Cemetery. Whenever they drew close to the house, Adolf quickened his pace or darted away over the road, pretending to be absorbed in a distant architectural detail. He didn't like sharing Meyer with anyone. Then Meyer, smiling to himself, followed patiently. They would stand at the railings, looking down into the cemetery below, or descending by the path, meander between laurel and dusty rhododendron, discussing the merits of the new cathedral, 1/3 built, rising like an improbable airship out of the sunken graveyard. Last year it had been taller, and the year before, taller still. They keep knocking it down, said Meyer, and starting all over again. Once it resembled a child's sandcastle. Whatever it is thereafter, it seems to evade them. Soon, he fancied, the structure might escape altogether. Bursting from its moorings, it would lift, zeppelin-shaped and pink as a rose, into the scudding clouds. Always Meyer took Adolf to the pier head. They stood, buffeted by wind, facing the mile-wide strip of river separating Liverpool from New Brighton. The ferry boats, not the fiery boats, the ferry boats encircled by screaming gulls plowed the muddy stretch of water toward the bulbous domes of the pleasure gardens and back again. Shouting to make himself heard, Meyer stabbed his finger at the skyline and named the docks, the battery, and the distant Welsh hills. He spoke of sailing ships forced to wait a dozen tides before floating into the Mersey, of the construction of the docks of cholera, of how the monopolies of the great trading companies, the Hudson Bay, the Royal Africa, the East India, had eventually been broken. Finally, placing his arm enthusiastically about Adolf's shoulder, he would swing round and point at St. Nicholas's Church, the offices of the docks and the harbor board, and the vast bulk of the Royal Liver Building, its twin towers set with clocks like full moons, and those giant birds, green wings spread, crouched under the sky. Consider, he would bellow, the advantages of cast iron. His lectures, delivered in the teeth of the wind, entire sentences blown away, excited and silenced Adolf. Adolf didn't wish to appear stupid. He stood with his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his fluttering coat, an expression of eager concentration on his gaunt face. All he wanted deep down was for Meyer to compare him favorably with the buildings, the people, the past. At times like these, Meyer considered him a good listener. Shortly after midday, footsore and exhausted by the sound of his own voice, Meyer would suggest they go to the Cardamom Cafe or to a public house. Adolf invariably refused. Ah, Meyer would exclaim, I had forgotten you were a lone wolf. Thanking him profusely, Adolf would shake him by the hand and return to the house in Stanhope Street. He didn't want Meyer to tire of him, and besides, he hadn't a halfpenny to his name. For an hour or so he'd help Bridget in small ways. carrying coals up from the cellar, rolling sheets of newspaper into wads to stuff along the cracks of the window frames, remembering summer holidays in Spital when, as a boy, he had played near the blacksmith's forge. He began to hammer at length of steel piping into the semblance of a handle. He would kneel at the gate, the metal rod hot from the red hot. Let me say that again. The metal red hot from the fire, and tap away at it with the heavy end of the poker. Bridget was terrified he might burn a hole in the carpet. I know what I'm doing, he assured her, thinking it was typical of Alois to have a gramophone and no means of winding it up. Sometimes he would spend half an hour playing with the baby, tickling him under the chin or blowing gently into his face until the child blinked and gurgled and butted his forehead against the brown shirt. What's this guy saying? Then it was time to go downstairs and put the kettle on the stove in readiness for Meyer's return. Adolf had now been residing in Liverpool for 5 weeks. It was difficult for him to remember that he had ever lived anywhere else. So secure did he feel, so cozily at home. How long is this chapter? Do I keep reading? I kind of want to know who won the World Series. All right, let's do it. Chapter 11. How long are you staying? Asked Meyer a week later. They were walking up the boulevard towards the park. Adolf stumbled and nearly fell. He had just finished discussing certain aspects of Alois's character, his greed, his stupidity, his tendency to boast. He had then referred briefly to the time Alois was sent to prison. After all, on that occasion, Alois had been little more than a youth. No malice was intended. Meyer, with his seemingly innocent inquiry, had rapped him over the knuckles as though he were a little boy who needed to be taught his manners. The bourgeois rebuke was obvious. He shouldn't bite the hand that fed him. Surely it went without saying that Alois provided him with food and lodging. Did Meyer take him for a fool? Had he not been so deeply wounded, he might have borrowed Alois's phrase and shouted in Meyer's face that it took two to make the bargain. It was the word stain that hurt most, implying that there was somewhere else he belonged. Dear God, he had been so confident of Meyer's ability to understand him that he could have wept. I am 54, announced Meyer, continuing to pace the gravel walk as though nothing had happened. I came here when I was 20. I left Berlin thinking I would be absent for a few weeks. I did not mean to stay. I have no intention of staying, cried Adolf instantly. He was so distressed he lost his sense of direction and began to bump into trees. Miss O'Leary is a different case, Meyer said. She came here when she was a small child. In a sense, she is not a foreigner. I have never been anything else. If you can believe the newspapers, myself and others like me are the sole cause of all the trouble in this town. We have infiltrated the corn exchange, the shops, the restaurants, the theater, orchestras. The agitators complain that we take employment away from the decent English working man. And have you any idea who he is, my young friend? Why, he is an Irishman. He glanced curiously at Adolf, who, with clenched fists, was varying from side to side on the path. Let us sit down, Meyer suggested. I am out of breath. They sat at some distance from one another on a bench under a tree. They were sandwiched between two roads along which the trams rattled in either direction. The rain fell steadily, dripping from branch to branch, forming puddles in the hollows of the path. A decade later I arrived, Meyer said. Water was supplied to the houses on only 3 moorings a week, even for the rich. Just think of it. It was difficult to tell whether Adolf was thinking of it or not. He was staring morosely at the toe caps of his muddy boots. First, I was in Munich, Meyer reminisced, then Berlin. In neither place did it rain so often as here. Still, Adolf made no response. Meyer searched his mind for a topic of conversation that would raise the young man's spirits. For some reason, Adolf seemed to have fallen into an abrupt and black depression. His face was quite contorted with misery. You would like Munich, Meyer remarked. It is a city of artists. It is not as beautiful as Vienna, but the people are more friendly. Doubtless it's swarming with Jews, Adolf said. German Jews, certainly, agreed Meyer. It is my belief, Adolf told him in a voice querulous with despair, that European history is merely the history of racial struggle. The decline of the Roman Empire is a classic example of historical decadence resulting from contaminated blood. Like Rome, Europe is sinking under the burdens of bastard peoples. Animals stick to their own kind. The tiger doesn't mate with the elephant. It might prove difficult, said Meyer, unless the elephant could be persuaded to lose weight. In pure blood, shouted Adolf, spawns impure ideas and creeds. We've not only the Jews to contend with, but the Slavs, the socialists, the Habsburg monarchists, the Roman Catholics, the Croats. There would seem to be no one left, Meyer observed mildly. Europe is rotten at the core, splintered Adolf. Rotten. He couldn't repeat the word often enough. That small adjective contained all the wretchedness he felt at Meyer's rejection of him. Let Meyer buy him a ticket tomorrow to Munich, to Africa, for all the difference it would make. School had been rotten, and his father in Linz and Vienna. Even his beloved mother had died rotten of a cancer. It was a rotten world. My dear boy, said Meyer kindly, concerned by the whiteness of his face. You are too sensitive. You shouldn't upset yourself so much. He tried to pat Adolf's arm, but the young man shrugged him off. It will be no comfort to you, Meyer said, but we have all felt the same at your age. Over one obsession or another. With me it was music. I wanted to be a success. I dreamed of being famous. Such things don't interest me, muttered Adolf, lying. He was behaving, Meyer thought, for all the world as though they'd had a lover's tiff. I'm going to visit my friend Cephalus, he said firmly. You should come too. He is a remarkable man, a man of the world. He will cheer you up. He stood and waited a moment. Adolf couldn't resist one last parting shot. If Alois is doing so well in business, he said, why on earth does he play the waiter at night? A man, replied Meyer quietly, needs capital. So they tell me. He began to walk briskly away down the avenue of trees. He half expected Adolf to remain where he was, or to disappear in the opposite direction. However, when he reached the dairy and looked back before crossing Upper Parliament Street, Adolf was behind him, sullen but following. How long is this next chapter? Yeah, I'm not reading this next one. Too long. Too long, brobs. All right. We'll return with chapter 12 next time. From Young Adolf by Beryl Bainbridge, a 1978 novel. I think, yes. All right, that's all, brobs.